Hello everyone, this is the first video, an introduction to the epistles or letters of Paul. And I want to spend just a little time giving you some background on first century letters, what it actually meant to Paul to write a letter, and then what impact that has on how we interpret the letter. First thing we all need to understand is the challenge that Paul faced. He would go to a place, he would start a church, and then after a fairly short period of time, he would leave, perhaps never to return as far as he knew. Now we know that on occasion he did return, but as far as the people there were concerned, they might never see Paul again. And on many occasions, not too long after he left, he would hear about problems in the church or understand that they needed more teaching or that there was something that he needed to address. Now, Paul couldn't go back to those people, so as a substitute for his personal presence, Paul would write them a letter. And really, if you think about it, that's all he could do. And I think that's one reason that you see the importance of prayer starting off in so many of Paul's letters, because all he can do is pray for the people in that city and that church and depend on the Holy Spirit to guide them. So he sends these letters back to them to substitute for his personal preference and use as a way to help the churches solve their individual and particular problems. Just like today, first century letters followed a standard format. Today we'd start a letter with "Dear Sir." We would have an introduction to the letter to tell someone what the letter is about, and then we might end the letter with "Sincerely" in our name. And just in the same way, first century letters typically started with greetings from the person who was writing it, or in other words, an identification. And we see this in Paul's letters, where he very often starts with Paul and a description, and he gives greetings. Then there would typically be an introduction or a thanksgiving section to the letter, the body of the letter, and then the letter would end with greetings from the people around the letter writer and perhaps travel plans or something like that. So you can see that Paul's letters in general follow the pattern of a first century letter. Now, one way they're different is they're much longer, and there are a couple of reasons for that. One is just the expense and effort involved in creating a letter. Illiteracy was very, very common in the first century, in different estimates, but as many as 90% or as much as 90% of the population might not be able to read or write, so they'd have to engage a scribe to do that. The second thing was the scribe was relatively expensive, and paper, or at that time papyrus, was also relatively expensive. So you see the typical letter in the first century would not be a whole sheet of paper, but would many times be a scrap torn off the corner of another letter or an official document or something like that the scribe would use to write a fairly short letter. So if someone were going to a different city for some reason, when they got there, they might write a short letter home, and the content of the letter might be really just as simple as, "Hi Mom, this is your son, everything's fine, send money, I'm in good health, see you soon." And then this couldn't obviously be delivered by a postal service, so the letter writer, after he found the scribe, paid the scribe, had to find somebody going back to his home city that would agree to carry that message. The part that is important for understanding of Paul is that the person carrying the message, if he could read, would actually read the letter to the person it was sent to, and obviously give any kind of other personal details, because the letter was very short, and I feel sure the mother wanted to know how her son was doing and what he looked like and if he had lost weight and things like that. So, but the importance for Paul is if the person can read who's delivering the letter, the person also explains the letter. Now this bears particularly into letters like Romans, which we'll talk about are very, very important to Paul, but he sends Phoebe to deliver the letter. She reads the letter to the different churches in Rome, we assume, and then she has an enormous task that I would not want to be responsible for. She has to try to explain what Paul means in some of his sections of Romans. So you see that the process of writing a letter is very complicated. If we look at some of Paul's letters that are very long, you start thinking about the expense of those and the effort in creating these letters, we start to get some idea of how important these letters are to Paul. Paul doesn't just sit down and write Romans in an afternoon. A complicated letter like that would take weeks or perhaps even months. He's consulting some of the scrolls he's had, he's thinking, he's praying. He understands the problems he wants to address, and he's probably trying out sections of the letters on Timothy or Luke, maybe whoever is with him, and he'll say, well, how does this sound? And then based on their input and the inspiration of the Holy Spirit, he might go back and tweak and change the letter, thinking about how it all fits in. Then at some point at the end, we know Paul used scribes. He would have to pay a scribe to write this whole letter out. So you see that letters that Paul wrote were not spur-of-the-moment things. They were long thought out. They were designed to address a situation, and they were expensive. So it means a lot for Paul to send a letter like Romans to Rome, or even the Galatians, letter to the Galatians to Galatia, because this is Paul's, that's all he can do to try to address the problems he knows about. Now the second thing that we need, or third thing we need to understand when we think about Paul's letters, is that they are very situation specific. Remember, Paul hears about problems or hears about the need for more teaching, and the only thing he can do is write a letter. Now given the time, effort, expense involved in that letter, if it's not necessary for the recipient to hear something, Paul's not going to take a lot of time talking about it. The letter to the Thessalonians is a good example. Paul talks about what happens when we die and the way Christians should mourn. And he did that apparently because it was a very particular problem in Thessalonica. We don't see that in Romans, for instance, because apparently in Rome people were not really concerned about what happened in the afterlife, or they had already learned what happened and they didn't need to be taught again. So Paul is very situational specific. And when we read his letters, we have to understand that they're written to a specific audience at a specific time to address a specific problem. We do not have anything in Paul's letters that resembles systematic theology. We have something that resembles occasional theology. And by that I don't mean something that happens every once in a while. I mean something that is designed for a specific occasion. So Paul has problems in Corinth. The people in Corinth send Paul a laundry list of things that they say, Paul, what should we do about this? And Paul responds with, well, concerning so-and-so, then he will tell them the theology behind that. So we have to be careful that we interpret Paul's letters correctly, because they are situational and occasional to a specific place. Now that doesn't mean they don't have eternal meaning. They absolutely do. But for instance, when Paul's writing to the Corinthians, he's writing to a people who have a specific problem. This guy is shacked up with his hot mother-in-law. And Paul is saying, this cannot happen, and he goes on to explain things like that. They have a big problem, apparently, with confusion in worship in the Corinthian church. So Paul is giving them ideas about how to conduct worship, how to use spiritual gifts. And he gives some very specific instances, the way women should dress, the way men should dress. And for instance, he said, that men's heads should be uncovered. Now, why would that be a big deal? If we understand that in Roman culture, not Christian culture, but in Roman or Hellenistic culture, men, when they were going to worship or to make sacrifices, would always cover their head. So if you saw a man on the street or a man in a building with his head covered, you would automatically assume that he was going to worship a pagan god or getting ready to sacrifice to a pagan god. So you can see what Paul is saying is that in this particular case, I believe, don't look like you're going to worship a pagan god or getting ready to make a sacrifice to a pagan god when you pray in church. Don't do anything that would confuse the people in the outside culture to make them think that you're worshiping a pagan god when you're really worshiping God. Now, I think there is an eternal principle in Paul's letters that apply to us today. But what we have to be careful about is that we take not so much the situational occasion, so the head covering or something like that, but say, what is the eternal principle of what Paul wants to do? And one of the eternal principles, I think, in Paul's letters is orderly worship. We worship an orderly God, not a God of chaos, and our worship reflects the character of the God we worship. So we need to worship orderly. We need to worship with respect. Our worship should reflect our state of mind in the God we worship. So what we need to do to apply that today, we take that eternal principle of orderly worship and apply it today to say, this is how we worship orderly today. Doesn't necessarily mean heads covered or uncovered, but whatever it does mean, it's orderly. The things happen one at a time, and we proceed in a fashion that is appropriate for us based on the eternal principles. So I hope that's given you a little background of why Paul wrote letters, the expense and effort of writing those letters, and maybe the beginning of an understanding of how we read these letters. And just as a final thing, I would recommend that as you read through the reading each week, that you would read each letter all the way through at least once, because that's the way the people experienced it. And if you want to get a little bit of a better flavor of how they actually experienced it, read it through aloud, or actually have someone read it to you, because like I said, since most of the people were illiterate, they couldn't read the letter, and one person in the church or the house group gathering would probably read the letter. So thank you for your time. I hope this has worked. If this is an effective means for little lecture pieces to give you some idea of the background, let me know. If it doesn't work, or there's something about it that you think could be better, please let me know about that. Make a forum entry.